Welcome everyone to Live from COP26. My name is Tara Ivanochko and I'm the Academic Director of the University of British Columbia Sustainability Initiative, and I will be moderating the event today. I'm joining you from UBC in the city of Vancouver on the unceded, ancestral and traditional lands of the Musqueam Nation. This land was not attained through negotiation, and here in British Columbia and in Canada, we are now in the hard but necessary process of reconciliation with the Indigenous peoples who occupied these lands long before colonization. As we hear from the delegates, the UBC delegates who are there or have been there at COP26, I'd ask you to acknowledge that it's the Indigenous peoples of the world who are disproportionately bearing the brunt of climate change. As a paleoclimate scientist, I've studied natural variability in climate systems and how they change over long periods of time. Also, the Killam curve, the graph that shows the upward trend of atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations superimposed over the annual cycle of the breathing of the planet, is the scientific legacy of my late father-in-law, Dr. Charles David Keeling. So I'm both professionally and personally very interested in climate science. But it's not a scientific breakthrough in climate science that we need right now in order to reduce our emissions and limit anthropogenic global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. From my perspective, the critical thing that needs to happen now is that the COP26 negotiators need to hear, respect, and respond with urgency to the calls for climate justice that we're hearing from the Indigenous peoples around the globe. If we do not, we're repeating the very same colonial practices that we here in Canada are now trying to rectify. So our team here at the UBC Sustainability Initiative has prepared a lively and engaging session for us to hear from the delegates, the UBC delegates at COP26. This year, the process for selecting delegates was an open process, and we've had the opportunity to choose 8 vibrant people from across variety of community at UBC, staff, students, and faculty. And today you're going to be hearing from a number of those as they share their experiences and perspectives of COP26. We're going to start with some questions to the panelists and get some in-depth responses from their experiences during the meetings. Then we'll be moving to a more rapid dialogue and responses to some of the headlines and images that we've been seeing come out of COP26. And finally, our panelists are going to be sharing with us some headlines, maybe hopeful for what they would like to see coming out of COP26. We acknowledge that the climate crisis is harming the planet and the people around the world. And we planned this event to try and engage our panel and audience in a full range of emotions that come with this event. And so this allows us to explore our shared concerns, but also work towards a hopeful future. In our commitment towards sustainability, we acknowledge the very real and pressing need to find connection and community around everyone who is working towards resolving this crisis. But we'll also try and bring some lightness and be joyful at times, have fun when we can, as we dig in to these serious issues. So we're going to start off hearing from our panelists. Our panelists are there. Maybe you can join me here in the room. Excellent. Great to see you all. How exciting to have you with us. I'll just make a note to the audience that you can find the bios of all of the panelists on the UBC Sustainability website. I will be introducing them very briefly as we start to engage with them around their questions. So I'm going to start with JUVARYA. JUVARYA VELTKAMP is the director of the Canada Climate Law Initiative at the Peter A. Allard School of Law here at UBC. JUVARYA, you've just returned from COP and have been writing a blog about your experiences and what was happening while you were there. And on day one, you identified it as chaotic and ambitious, but with pockets of hope. Unambitious, but with pockets of hope. So I'm wondering if you can describe some of that chaos for us.
Yes, absolutely, Tara. And thank you for your real amazing introduction and contextualizing the importance of this moment for us. I really liked the way that you contextualized that. And I'm also really happy someone was reading my blog. I tried to do it daily for at least the first 3 days. And thanks for following along as I collected my thoughts. And yeah, to be honest, I expected it to be chaotic. I did have the opportunity to go to COP21, and it was a privilege to have the opportunity to go as part of BBC's delegation as well this time. And I think the important thing to remember is it's not an ordinary conference. In fact, there are conferences, multiple conferences that happen sort of on the sidelines, tons of meetings and events and the marches and the activity. But the COP itself is this negotiation between 200 countries nearly. So it was always going to be a bit of a zoo, and you throw in COVID and there was a strike action. And so, you know, it was really really important to focus on what your objective is. And so my objective was to go and bring back kind of that actionable intelligence for Canadian business leaders and corporate governance leaders, so that our boards and executives in Canada can really take meaningful action on climate change. We need to know what's happening around the world and learn from it, so that, frankly, our businesses, our communities can be prepared for this massive economic transformation, right? So climate, economy, it's two sides of the same coin. If you're addressing the climate, you're transforming the economy, and we need to be ready for that. So like, who showed up? There was some really great sustainable finance announcements. That's the kind of thing that I was watching for. You will have heard of Mark Carney's GFANZ, the net zero finance sector. And that's a pocket of hope that I described. There's about 450 banks and investors and other financial institutions in that. They're saying that we're going to make our lending and our investing net zero. So Herculean effort by Mark Carney to get that done. But there's still a lot of greenwash happening. You know, a lot of our Canadian banks are signed up to GFANZ, but they're funding fossil fuels. Canada showed up and announced that we'll commit to a net zero oil and gas sector, but it's still an oil and gas sector, so there's still fossil fuels being burned. So, you know, and we haven't talked about subsidies, which I know some of my other colleagues on the call really know a lot about. So we need to get in front of this. Anyone on the call who lives in BC knows we've gone from the heat dome to now the atmospheric river. The UN Secretary General said that it's a code red for humanity. You can't use any stronger language than that. So I think Canada, we stood out maybe for a little bit of a lack of ambition, and we need that renewable energy future vision that we can get behind and really reduce oil and gas production. Who did show up? In COP, it's called the non-state actors. So the COP is a negotiation between the countries, but then there's cities and states and regions who are the non-state actors, and they really showed up. And so the last thing I'll say, you know, cities around the world have declared climate emergencies like UBC has, and that's really taking action. Today, I'm sad to miss it, but today is the Cities and Regions Day at COP, and I know that the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, that represents 11,000 member cities. They looked at all their cities and said 75% have more ambition than any of their national governments. So cities is where the action is, and I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay, thanks, JUVARYA. That's great to hear those comments there. And we'll have an opportunity to dig in a little bit more in the other sections. For the audience, I neglected to tell you that there is a question and answer opportunity. So if you do have a question, you can go into the question and answer feature. And after these conversations, I'll have a chance to select one or two of those to put to the panelists. If you put the name of the person who you're interested in answering the question, that would help me direct it. So next I'm going to go to RASHID SUMAILA, who is a University Killam professor and Canada Research Chair in Interdisciplinary Ocean and Fisheries Economics here at UBC. RASHID, you're now joining in week 2. So JUVARYA was there in week 1, and now you've just joined in. So how is the chaos shifting? And what are you feeling on the ground as the climate is starting to wrap up? Are there still pockets of hope? Oh, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself, please, Rashid.
Yeah, now I'm unmuted. Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction and for setting the stage, and thanks to JUVARYA, right? Sorry for messing up your name. People do that to me all the time, so sorry. And yeah, thanks for laying out that. Yeah, there are still pockets of hope. I came here and I'm happy to tell you that the chaos actually passed before I came. They seem to be learning. It's so much order now. The testing we do every day, I can just do my own in the room and the lines are all smooth and it's really improved. So less chaos, so that is nice. And the pockets of hope, I think there are, and I'm going to mention a few of them, but then I will also tell you some of the non-hopes, right? I mean, that I hear about. So in the first place, I see that I came here as an oceans person, and I've been looking at oceans and climate and the COP for some time. The ocean has almost always been left behind. And so one of the hopes I see is that the ocean is actually in the room now. And I was on a panel this afternoon with the envoy to the United Nations Secretary General, Peter Thompson. And he actually said, you know, we're out knocking for years, but now we're in. But there's still a long ways to go. If you look at the draft, there's mention of the ocean, but still not in detail. So we need more work there. And one of the hopes I saw is technology one, actually. There's something called Climate Tracer. This was put together by Al Gore, actually. He put non-profits and academics to find ways to use satellite technology and AI, machine learning and all that together. So now they actually have confirmed they're able to measure the amount of CO2 or greenhouse gases coming from sources by country or by company, by industry more precisely, you know. And I think this, Al Gore himself called this radical transparency in this business. And we need that. You need to measure to be able to check. So I find that to be very hopeful. Another thing is that there is a lot more on social justice, environmental justice. We have lots of indigenous people, I mean, lots, okay? We have much more than usual. And they made their voices heard. The Pacific Island states are there. Yesterday was on gender and equity, and so there was a lot on gender, which is is more than necessary. Have you guys seen the picture of the heads of state on the first or second day? And it was virtually 0 women. I could count 3 women, you know, so that's the kind of thing. And so gender is back there, and that is hopeful. More specifically, there is a pledge to end financing for foreign fossil fuel projects. This started with coal, and now they've enlarged. This is great, but I see a loophole. If they were to say no more funding of these projects for internally and externally, then I will be happy, because this seems to be the developing countries who are going to really pay the price here, and developed rich countries will do it within. China was the one who started this. So I think, to be more specific to Canada, Quebec actually joined the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance. I thought this was very nice for a Canadian province to do that. I would have been happier if this was Alberta, right? Then we know we're making progress, right? So yeah, we keep working at it. And there was a call for a global price for carbon. I think our Prime Minister was leading that charge, which is a great thing to see. But then you come down, and the bottom line is all these efforts. 100 countries have signed up to stop deforestation, which is great, right? When you add all this, are we going to achieve the goal of 1.5? And this is where I'm not that hopeful. Even the UN says, from all they've seen, we cannot do it. So there is a lot of work to do. And what's her name? What is it? Greta has actually declared the whole thing a greenwash jamboree. So that is something for us. We have to take her serious, right? So there's a lot of work to do, but there is hope. China and Russia didn't come. It was amazing how Obama took them on, in addition to Trump, for wasting the world's 4 years by pulling out the US. He took that on, and that was great to see. But today, there was a surprise announcement. I don't know whether you've heard it. China and the US actually have come up with a bilateral agreement to take action by 2035 or so. The details I haven't seen yet, so there is some hope. And net zero is up there and big. And I tell you, 3 countries are already at net zero. And all of them are developing countries: Bhutan, Suriname, and the 3rd one. So if these poor developing countries can do it, we can also do it. We just have to get up and take action. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rashid. That's it. Let's get up and take action. So we have some students who have been doing that, right? Some students who are taking action and have joined this delegation to COP. So we have EMAN, ALSULAITI, Max Cohen, and Temi ONIFADE. So we're going to hear from them. I'll start with Iman. Iman is a 4th-year undergraduate student in Central, Eastern, and North European Studies here at UBC. So Iman, what is this like for you this first time in your meeting, participation in COP?
Hi everyone, thank you Tara for your introduction. It was really a massive privilege for me to be able to attend COP26, especially after being cooped up because of COVID for so long. And I think it was a great opportunity for me to explore a bit more around my studies. So like you said, I'm majoring in modern European studies. So I think a really big focus for me going into COP was to explore the dynamics of intercultural communication and dialogue around climate change. And I think Dr. SUMAILA already mentioned the amazing, incredible, and really powerful presence of lots of Indigenous communities throughout COP, which shifted kind of the conversation towards more nature-based solutions to fight climate change, which was really great for me to learn about.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So Max, you're joining us from a Scottish pub, I understand. And sorry, I'll just say here. So Max, a PhD student at UBC's Department of Geography. So maybe tell us some of your interests and how things have been going at COP for you.
Thanks, Tara. Yeah, I'm in a hotel lobby, so sorry for the noise, but I hope it's okay. I'm Max, I'm a PhD student in geography, and I'm originally from Glasgow. So partly I was interested to go to COP for my research. So my research looks at the just transition in Scotland and New Zealand, who have an alliance at the moment to ensure workers are not left behind in the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy systems. But also I'm from Glasgow as well, so I was interested to see how the conference has impacted the city and how locals have also interacted with the conference. I found the conference when I first arrived, actually, I think the council and the Scottish government and the UK government missed an opportunity to engage with locals more about the conference, because I feel a lot of people felt a bit excluded from it. It has been, people are calling it the most exclusionary COP in the history of COP, so a lot of people haven't been able to attend due to logistical barriers, economic barriers, and due to COVID as well. But I've also felt in the city, a lot of people didn't really know what was happening as well. And I think that the governments could have done a kind of better job of dialoguing with locals on that. Internally, I found it's an interesting space to be in because there's so much going on. There's events all over. And it's hard, at the end of the day, you have to type up your notes to kind of just rethink about where you've been all day. And the events come to you in the morning as well, so you need to sort of plan your day as you go. I found to be, after today, a sort of distinction between the sort of side events and the sort of high-level negotiations between states. And I don't really know what's going on between states as well until the end of the day, so I'm following it on the news, because observers now aren't allowed into that space. But going to really interesting side events, so with academics, journalists, NGOs. There was one interesting one which was done by the United Nations Environmental, it's UNEP, UNEP, and their report is on the emissions gap. So it's on the gap between commitments that governments are making and the actual projections of where we're going in terms of temperature rise, and the number that they raised. So the Paris Agreement was to hopefully get to below 2 and hopefully below 1.5. And the projections from that report were that we're heading towards, on current projections, is 2.7 or 2.4, which some people have labeled more than, extremely serious, and for some people a death sentence in places as well. So it's there's that sort of like quite the science going on, it feels like, and the sort of side events and the important research and sort of politics taking place in the negotiations. And I want to see more interconnection there and more politicians actually responding to the science. So that's my more critical side of it. But it's been also interesting to see a lot of kind of new research in renewable technologies, like green hydrogen. I've seen quite a lot of interest in work on, and networking with other researchers. So I'll leave it at that for now. But yeah.
Great, thanks, Max. Thanks for bringing that up and sharing that with us. So Temi ONIFADE is a PhD candidate at the Peter A. Allard School of Law here at UBC. Temi, what was your intention of going to COP, and how has it been meeting your interests?
Thank you for the question that you do, Tara, and thanks to USI for having me. So I'm still digesting the information, but I'll start with your question. So I had two main goals going to COP. The first is to learn more about climate policy and justice under the global climate regime. And the second is to share my knowledge of Canada's climate governance. I have pursued those interests here. For my first goal, I've learned more about climate policy and justice, and which is also relevant to my PhD. There is an overwhelming consensus here that civil society should be more involved in making decisions. Also, countries should implement and increase ambition and action on the justice-related themes, such as finance, adaptation, loss and damage, and capacity building promptly, not just emissions mitigation. So that does, really come out in the conference. However, as someone coming from Canada, I think the most surprising thing for me was that of the diverse vulnerable groups, such as developing countries, children, women, workers, and so on, I think that while Indigenous peoples were there, they've actually received the least attention in the official agenda and activities. So at least within the blue zone. If you look at the agenda, you'd see that all the other vulnerable groups are fully, addressed in the agenda, but Indigenous peoples do not receive any specific attention. Now, it seemed to me that the assumption is that when you talk about Indigenous peoples, they're already covered under discussions of developing countries, but we know that there are unique climate-related concerns of Indigenous peoples that are not, fully covered. For instance, those in Canada, right? That's not a developing country; it's a developed country. So there are unique needs of Indigenous peoples in places like Canada. So on my second focus on Canada's climate governance, I shared my experience with, some media organizations, CBC, Global News. However, what's even more valuable is learning more about Canada's work on climate finance at COP26. So I was pleasantly surprised when the new Minister of Environment and Climate Change mentioned or announced that Canada has been working with Germany to create a climate finance delivery plan for developing countries. However, the plan seems to focus on delivering the overdue 100 billion Green Climate Fund. But anyone remotely familiar with climate finance will know this amount is inadequate, and climate finance should flow from numerous public and private sources. There are some other problems that he also addressed. So I was happy to hear the minister note some of the challenges with delivering climate finance. For instance, the failure of finance to get to the most vulnerable people within developing countries. That's an experience I had firsthand while practicing law in Nigeria. And that's what actually led me to the field of climate change. So moving to my most important experience, perhaps the outstanding central lesson for me is that the North-South divide is fading while the state civil society divide seems to be increasing. So let me briefly explain that. The North-South divide is fading because the fundamental ground for disagreement are reducing. For instance, unlike previously, most developed countries no longer deny responsibility or the idea that they should provide finance, technology, and other forms of support to developing countries. The debate is now more about, how to provide those forms of support. However, we can see that civil society has increasingly challenged governments and claiming that they're not doing enough. So I think I'll leave it at that for now.
Great. Thank you, Temi. Thank you, Temi. Those are probably themes that we'll see develop a little bit more in some of the comments and questions that come up later. So our last panelist here is Kathy Harrison. Kathy is a professor in the Department of Political Science at UBC. And many of her publications we have access to on our website. So you might be able to find some things you're looking for there. And Kathy, you have been in attendance at COP before. So what has COP26 delivered this time that is new or different from what you witnessed before?
So I would say that, so I was at COP25 2 years ago, and there are 3 differences this time. 2 of them are pressing sort of push for more ambition, stronger action, and one of them is contrary. The 2 that give urgency to the negotiations this time is first, the way the Paris Agreement works is that it's an iterative process. You know, everybody knew in 2015 that the pledges that were made were not enough to get to well below 2C, ideally 1.5C, but every 5 years, countries are supposed to come with new pledges. So this is the first ratchet year, the year that new pledges were coming in. So that gives it importance right there. It's also realistically the last ratchet year that can keep 1.5 alive, because such deep cuts are needed, 45% below 2010 levels by 2030, to put us on that path to 1.5C, that if we don't start making progress right away, it will be gone and we'll probably pass 1.5 early in the next decade. So those 2 things have increased the urgency, and then the pandemic has made it all more difficult. As others have said, there is less access to this COP from developing countries, from civil society. The room capacities aren't as great. The venue gets full. You know, we get messages at about 12:30 every day that the venue's at maximum capacity. Time is being lost because in every 1 hour period, everybody has to get out so they can clean all the tables for 15 minutes. There's less informal gathering happening. So those things are all just making it more difficult. What has it delivered? Not enough. Going into the COP, the national pledges called NDCs were only enough to put us on track to keep us on track to a maximum of 2.7 Celsius of warming. In the first week of COP, it's a technical week, and there was also a flurry of announcements on forestry, on financing, on public finance of fossil fuels, on coal for electricity. Those are all great, but they need to be translated into more ambitious NDCs, and that hasn't happened yet. There have also been a lot of net zero pledges for 2050 and 2060. It's really easy. Every year I say I'm going to lose 15 pounds by the end of the year, and then I don't do anything about it. And in December, it's too late. So there's real concern that a lot of those net zero pledges are bogus. So where are we now after the first week? Probably more at about 2.4 Celsius. If one is really optimistic that everybody's serious about their net zero pledges, we could be 1.8 to 2.1. And so we're now at the stage of the ministerials. That's where things go behind closed doors. Periodically, there are draft texts that are released, and we saw some important ones today, and stocktake meetings where there are summaries discussed, and there was one of those as well today. What the latest cover decision, that's sort of the summary of the whole meeting, the draft that was released today, basically acknowledges that we're not going to, the pledges for this COP aren't going to be enough to stay at 1.5C, and calls on countries to come back next year. So the countries that have just said net zero by 2050 are expected to put meat on the bones next year. Countries that have announced pledges are expected to bring tighter pledges for 2030. There's a lot of talk about climate finance, the failure of the wealthy countries to meet their goal of 100 billion a year by 2020. So to meet that goal and to up their game from 2025 to 2030, lots of talk in those texts, but no dollar figures, not on mitigation, not on adaptation, and even less progress on loss and damage. Tomorrow we should get new texts, and I think it's really important that China-US agreement. I'm not sure what impact it will have on the text itself, unless the US throws a lot more money into the pool for climate finance. But I think it can give a real boost to the pressure for more ambitious 2030 targets, especially because that agreement commits to China and the US collaborating on 1.5C and actions in this decade. And that's what we really need.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I'm reading some of the questions that are coming up from the panel, and you've been sort of talking to many of them. So I'm trying to look for one that we haven't really dealt with too much. And I'm seeing this one here from Fiona. What are panelists' thoughts about the discussions around the divide around net zero? So Kathy, you were just bringing this up. On the one side, we hear politicians and states pushing this agenda as the big solution. And on the other, we hear various Indigenous voices and land workers saying net zero is a false solution and one that perpetuates systems of colonialism. Is anybody willing to tackle that question for a minute? Okay, let's go to JUVARYA for a second. Yeah.
Thanks, Tara. Yeah, I think this is really, really important. And from my previous history, I used to work at the City of Vancouver as part of the Greener City Action Plan. So I have some thoughts on it from that perspective as well. But it's absolutely right. When you think of the NDCs, as Kathy was talking about, so nationally determined contributions, it's what we're emitting here in Canada, right? That's why, or in whichever country you're in. So that's why we say we could have a net zero oil and gas sector, because when we produce it, it's net zero, but it's still creating emissions somewhere else. And same when it starts to come to corporate announcements around net zero. Not getting too technical, but there are different scopes of emissions, scope 1, 2, 3. 1 and 2 is the energy that you sort of use in your operations or purchase to fuel your cars. But scope 3 is what are people doing with your product, maybe what's happening in your supply chain. And so there have been even on the sidelines of COP in the UK, they're asking for mandatory disclosure of this kind of information related to carbon. We might have that come to Canada, but none of it is dealing with scope 3. So it is just moving the challenge to elsewhere. So I absolutely think that net zero can be problematic. There are ways to approach it. There's the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which is trying to standardize things. One of the other really important announcements made during COP was by the global, one of two global accounting bodies, the IFRS, International Financial Reporting Standards, and they're developing a sustainability reporting standard that could be across the world, creating that standard. Are they going to say that scope 3 emissions need to be included when you talk about net zero? We don't know. The Secretary General, UN Secretary General, also said that they are creating a body that will look at net zero commitments and assess them and create some standards. But can it happen fast enough? I don't know. What was really interesting at City of Vancouver is, we had a lot of commitments around net zero emissions buildings, net zero emissions, a lot of different targets under the Greener City Action Plan. But what happened in the City of Vancouver was maybe halfway through, I can't remember the year, it was 2015, 2016, we decided to have a renewable energy target rather than what you're reducing and fighting about what you're reducing and does it include everything. This positive target of 100% renewable energy, something to work towards. So I could see, I think, oil and gas, I felt from this COP, has lost its social license, right? We can have permission now to, without demonizing the sector, just saying, look, it's lost its social license elsewhere. We really need to wake up to that fact that the world has changed. Let's look at renewable, and as others have said, like, this is the just transition, and let's transition our economy away. So I think that's what I'd like to say.
Great. So this question has generated a lot of conversation. Kathy, I saw your hand go up really, really fast in the beginning. Did you still have something? I see now we have 4 people who want to comment on it. So I'm going to ask you to, no, okay, I'm going to pass it along, but I'm going to, I'll go Rashid and then Max and then Iman, but try and keep your answers pretty succinct so that we can maybe get to another question if there's time.
I find net zero to be one of those catchy, beautiful slogans, right? That can hide a lot of things. What we need is just for countries to just say, what are you going to do to reduce your impact, right? So imagine that we have quotas assigned to countries or even individuals. You have a budget. This is the budget. This is the total we can emit and be at 1.5. Everybody get your budget. Fix it. That's it. All this net zero business is a way to hide away from some real action, I think. Thank you.
Great. Max, what about your thoughts? Oh, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself, please.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to agree with what JUVARYA was saying, and just also to kind of reiterate to maybe be a bit careful of net zero as well, because it's a smaller scale. So in some universities, it's been adopted in places where emissions are necessary, and it can be used as a way to calculate what emissions they're also taking out from the production as well. But it's also being adopted by companies in the fossil fuel industry as well, and using carbon credits to offset from the continued extraction from fossil fuels. And it is the case that fossil fuels have lost legitimacy in this as well during this COP, but at the same time are still receiving, I think the latest IMF report was 11 million per minute in subsidies from governments around the world. So it's in the realm of trillions. So still heavily financed by the public sector. And so that needs to be discussed as well.
Okay, thank you. And Iman, comments from you.
I think I wanted to bring in maybe a different aspect to Fiona's question, maybe to address the towards the end of her question, she talks about whether the solution or proposed solution perpetuates systems of colonialism. I wanted to suggest or maybe bring to light the fact that lots of Indigenous groups and us as well as the UBC delegation, we attended COP26 as observers. And this, I feel, really limited what we were able to do during our time at COP. And I think this is particularly important for the Indigenous groups and communities who had, crossed seas to attend COP26 and were promised, a platform and to have all this representation. But I think something that I'd seen was by the time Indigenous communities were able to take the stage, lots of world leaders left the action room by that point. But I think, and I'd like to bring in kind of a youth perspective as well, all this scrutiny, I think really does help. And I think what I'm saying now answers Rob's question about would we advise unilateral action. Obviously, to begin with, multilateral action is essential, is really crucial, especially at this time, the sooner the better, to achieve real change. But I think that what my experience of COP really taught me was that, that this was really reflective of literally like the wider world. And so it starts with the community, honestly. And so with all the demonstrations that took place throughout COP and that will continue to take place by youth groups, by Indigenous communities, and by local communities as well, I think there is still hope, hopefully.
Okay, great. I'm going to cut it off after that one. We're going to move to the next section. I can see that we have a great engaged group, and I'm going to have to be a little bit stringent with your timing. I'm going to start kind of cutting you guys down. But we're going to move to a different approach, and we're also going to bring in David TINDALL, who's also attending COP26. So he is a professor at UBC in sociology, and he's been at COP with a media pass. You can see there he's joining us from the media room at and has been doing a lot of writing with the Observer, I believe you've been writing with. So you can look up some of his work there. So David, I'm going to ask you to join in with us now as we respond to some of the images and headlines that we've been seeing at COP. So maybe we can see our first image. Okay, who's in the room and who's not? And this is also addressing one of the questions that the audience put forward. So maybe I'll jump to David. David, what do you think about this image that you're seeing here?
Well, I think as one of the panelists already talked about, or actually a few panelists have talked about, there's certainly some groups that have not had very much access, in particular Indigenous peoples and people from the developing world have had more difficulty getting, especially from NGOs and so on, and that have trouble getting into the room. There has been a lot of buzz about fossil fuel lobbyists, and in fact, there was some very pointed questions to the COP president just the other day at a press conference, but basically the COP officials denied that that the decision making had anything to do with lobbyists.
Great, thanks. Kathy, you had up your hand up before. Maybe I can switch your direction and think about this one. How do you respond to this image?
None of it's new. There have always been a lot of fossil fuel representatives at these meetings. And in fact, I assume that's one of the reasons why an international climate agreement that is doesn't mention fossil fuels. They're 75% of the problem, and the words aren't in the Paris Agreement. That said, I don't think we should kid ourselves that if the fossil fuel lobbyists weren't in the room, that the countries, the governments of the countries that are major fossil fuel producers wouldn't be saying and doing exactly the same things.
Temi, what do you think?
Yeah, so I mean, this is one of the points I raised earlier. For me, in fact, I took some pictures while in the plenary, one of the plenary rooms. And if you look at some of the chairs, the names, the tags there are mostly countries from, developing part of the world. Also, I think while we actually had some representatives of developing countries, I think what was the most surprising was, the attention of the actual official program on Indigenous peoples. I didn't see much on Indigenous peoples at all. So I think if we're to put it on a scale, I was actually more worried about Indigenous peoples than even developing countries.
Okay, thank you. Maybe let's move to our image number 2. There we go. That might be a bit tough to see. We've got some headlines here. Over 40 countries pledge at the UN Climate Summit to end the use of coal. End of coal in sight at COP26. And Canada is weaning itself off thermal coal, but keeps shipping it elsewhere. Anybody have a comment on this one? I'll let you just jump in.
Yeah, this relates to this finance, the stopping of financing outside of country borders, right? And keeping what you do internally. So it's similar. And I see this as a way for big, powerful, rich countries to get away with some of the mess, So yeah, I don't like it.
Can I jump in on this one?
Absolutely.
These were also countries committing to end their own coal-fired electricity generation, which is, and including some that are developing countries. So that was very encouraging to me. And the thing about Canada's exports of thermal coal is that the federal government has committed to phase that out by 2030 as well. So I do think we've seen some genuinely encouraging things about coal at this COP, but those pledges need to be incorporated in more ambitious NDCs.
Great. Temi, I see your hand up.
Yeah, just a quick one. For me, I think that phasing out coal is overdue. Phasing out fossil subsidies for coal is overdue. I think we should be talking about oil and gas. So I do not see this as some impressive, progress. I mean, it is going to contribute, but I think we should already be talking about oil and gas.
Okay, JUVARYA, do you have something to add on to this one?
No, it's been said.
Okay, great. Okay, let's maybe go to image number 3. Okay, some more headlines. COP26, deal to end deforestation, not fast or bold enough. From Global News, Trudeau signs COP26 pledge to end deforestation by 2030. What does it mean for Canada? And COP26, Indonesia criticizes, and then I can't see the rest of that one. Maybe we can but it's going to have something to do with deforestation. So maybe Iman, let's go to you on this one. Can you
Yes. Yep. So the deal to commit to ending deforestation was one of the biggest and earliest deals to come out of COP26. And at the time I was at the Brazil Pavilion, so there was a great deal of dialogue happening there. And not all of it was positive, interestingly enough. I would like to bring in from my own experiences at COP was that one of the indigenous groups representing the Amazon was saying that this was great because it was turning towards more nature-based solutions, as I mentioned earlier, talking about ending deforestation and talking about reforestation as well. But then I'd like to talk about the last headline, which is Indonesia's situation, which obviously they're claiming that this would be quite damaging to the economy, but also it's not the right route for Indonesia to go specifically because they need to, continue developing the country essentially. So this was a really interesting point, and I think it's worth really looking into, especially for Fiona, who asked a question earlier about perpetuating colonialism.
Great, thank you. Rashid, I see your hand up.
Yeah, 2 quick points. I mean, I like the agreements, the 100 countries. My only point is the implementation. We do have good agreements all over. It's always the last stage. Will they implement? Who is going to watch them and make sure they do this? The second point is that I wish we had something for fisheries. Stop overfishing, because overfishing is also negative to climate change. So stopping overfishing is climate action. So that's the next thing I would love to see in future COPs.
Okay, Iman, are you coming another point? Is your hand coming up again?
Just a quick hand to quickly talk about what I was hearing at the Brazil Pavilion, talking about how a very similar deal had come out in 2014, I believe, but was never really followed up on. And that was the big point of COP26, was to really build in mechanisms. So I think that's something we're still waiting on to see.
Okay, great. So I'm interested now in just a bit of a discussion that we can have about your experience here and thinking about what's been missing at COP. A number of these things have been brought up, but what do you think there should have been more of, right? So in your experience now, what were you expecting, or should there have been more discussion around that we have not yet seen? Maybe I'll go to David there and follow, well, to put you on the spot, or let's let JUVARYA start because she's already keen off the top, and then
we'll wait for David to go first.
No, go ahead. You put your hand up.
Okay, I will just share a couple of things that I did that were sort of outside of the COP. So I attended 2-day sessions that were on climate law and governance. And I think that conversation was really interesting for me. So, people have talked on the call about loss and damage, and moving from not just climate finance, which is the idea that we need to finance mitigation, we need to finance adaptation, but that small island states or countries like Bangladesh, whose agriculture is failing because of sea level rise and salt inundating their farmland, like they want to sue for loss and damage. So I think that is really interesting. And then for me, translating that into the business sector. So there apparently is, very small but increasing focus on, is there litigation? Are companies turning to the courts for loss and damages due to other companies? Are there going to be cases where they're turning in competitors for putting out false claims around net zero or greenwashing? Apparently John Kerry was in a room talking to a bunch of lawyers. I wasn't there, but he said, you're all climate lawyers now. And so just expecting that this is going to transform. And so then what does that mean in terms of educating? Are our courts ready? Are our lawyers ready? Are our judges ready to review these cases? I thought that was really interesting, and would give things that come out of COP more teeth if we are able to use the law and able to sort of reform our, all of these institutions to serve this purpose. So that's it.
Great, thanks. Anyone else? Or maybe I'll go to David now. I'm going to jump into David to give him a chance to share some ideas with us.
Sure. So I'm not going to answer your question directly. I have kind of a slightly different tangent here, but one of the things, as a sociologist, I'm quite interested in social movements and the protesters and so on. And one of the things that I've observed is there's a very different mood outside the venue than there has been inside the venue. So inside the venue, I think there's some cautious optimism and some hope, some excitement and stuff. Outside the venue, there's a lot of cynicism and anger and other types of emotions. And I think for people who aren't here, it's quite interesting. Depending on what the source of the information is, you might get a totally different impression as to what's going on. The thing that I would also add is people who study social movements and politics and so on sometimes talk about insiders and outsiders. So there's people that are involved in social movements and NGOs and so on. And some of them are insiders and are in the venue and are working with these groups. And some people are outside and they play more of a protest role. And, I think you get very different views on what's going on, and these groups play very different roles. And I found that quite interesting to kind of watch in action.
Great, thank you. And I think your article today talking about the youth movement and the role that the youth movement is playing and whether it's here to stay, maybe is speaking to some of these comments that you're seeing in the inside and outside groups there. Temi, what did you want to add to this conversation?
So thanks, Tara. From the contribution of someone from the World Bank and a few other folks from the business world, I get the feeling that, businesses and financial actors still want governments to de-risk low carbon transition before they divert their resources to it. That is, make it less risky. So let governments go first, then they come later. I think this reasoning is quite business as usual, but it is short-sighted. So climate risks are already in real and financial economies, so I'm not sure why anyone would want to wait. So what is missing from COP26? To address your question, I think it has failed to emphasize why corporates and financial actors need to think about the long term, right? They should be planning in the long term, not the short term. So they shouldn't focus on short-term profits. So my short answer is that they can save money and mitigate exposure to several types of risks while becoming leaders in a profitable low carbon economy. JUVARYA and I work for CCLI, where we do those kind of work. And that's what I think I want to be really thinking about going forward.
Okay, thank you. Any other person? Max, we haven't heard from you from a bit, and Kathy's got it. Okay, Kathy, go ahead. And then Max, maybe you can close up this round.
Three things that I would have wanted to see: greater ambition. And the fact is, we can't fix climate change unless we stop emitting fossil fuels. And the targets are not even close to where we need to be. So boom, that's the big one. More money. It's going to take a lot of money from the wealthy countries, especially to the developing countries, to help reinforce that ambition, but also because we owe them to help adapt because they are paying the price for our emissions. And finally, more attention to fossil fuels, which are causing this problem. And instead of just talking coal, we need to be winding down both consumption and production of oil, coal, and gas, rather than expanding them, which Canada is still planning to do in the case of both oil and gas.
Okay, thanks, Kathy. Yeah, really hit it right there. 3 points, right? That's what's missing. Max, any comments on this one?
Yeah, just reiterate what Kathy was saying. I think the greatest paradox of it is that fossil fuels have had so much influence in this conference, but have had so little coverage within the actual regulations of them themselves. And in Paris, they're completely non-existent on the supply side. And fossil fuels constitute almost 90% of CO2 emissions. So it needs to be, that's where the focus needs to be on, specifically on subsidies to fossil fuel companies. So that's something I would like to see. I don't know. It was interesting because there was someone talking about there was a nature and land day this time, which apparently hadn't been in previous COPs, which was good to see. Someone was saying that there needs to be a greater sense on food systems, because there still wasn't a food day at this particular COP, so they were hoping that would be in the next one as well. But in a word, fossil fuels. I was going to say something.
Okay, great, thanks. Temi, I think maybe your hand is up from before. Is that true? Okay, so I'm going to go straight to Rashid.
Yeah, so Temi, you made a very passionate plea about companies being more long-term. As an economist, I'm sorry to say, usually they don't take preaches. They don't just say, oh, we do it because it's nice. So this means we as a society, we really need to make some decisions, tough ones. And I see a lot of weakness in states, where everything is kind of left to people and what can you do? Please do this, do that. So we need more regulation, and we need to be tough on ourselves and our companies. And one of the things you can do, it has come up again and again, take away the subsidies that lead to overfishing, deforestation, oil and gas, move these subsidies from doing bad to everybody, to the environment, to turn them into doing good for society and for people, nature and people. So that would be one way you get companies to sit up. You just have to hit them in their pockets. I'm sorry to say.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I'm going to bring up one more question from the audience here. We have a question from Alexandra, who's interested in advice for elementary and secondary school students who have an interest in environmental sustainability, but maybe lacking enthusiasm around these types of climate conferences. Right? So how do we engage, or is there a need to, what's the role of engaging more broadly to help the population, the public, understand what's happening at a meeting like COP? Iman, I'll go to you.
I think what I'll say is there's been lots of youth climate activists attending this COP specifically, and that's only because of the power of youth scrutiny and action. So there was the pre-COP, which took place in Milan. And one of the biggest outcomes of that was the pledge to introduce climate change into the curriculum. And I'm sure that that's bound to increase awareness around climate change and improve, climate change literacy, which will no doubt improve this.
Great, thanks, Max.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so one of my friends is a teacher here in Glasgow, and she didn't, and as I was saying at the beginning, I think there could have been more effort by Glasgow City Council to talk to educational institutions to sort of mobilise support for COP and sort of public opinion around it. I think that what kids did here basically was just mobilise themselves, and we saw that with a huge protest on the Friday and on the Saturday as well. So if you're in elementary school or secondary school, just talk to your classmates, talk to your teacher as well, because there's teachers who want to get involved as well, but don't feel supported by their institutions or by government as well. So mobilise among yourselves and keep up pressure.
Thanks, Max. JUVARYA.
Oh, thank you. Three things. So I think what I've heard at this COP, looking at climate through the lens of human rights, so a right to life, a right to a healthy environment, that really personalizes it rather than thinking about emissions and gases. And so I think that's a real shift. There was some litigation cases against national governments where they won, and it was based on, in Germany, right to freedom, right? And also, I think, Max, you picked up on food. Food is such a way to excite people, engage people, particularly children, around climate. Climate has such an impact on food. We are looking at food deserts all over the world and drought. So engaging younger children in regenerative agriculture and the idea of soil health, I think, is really tangible. And then the last thing is the Climate Reality Leadership Corps. So Al Gore has a mission to train 75,000 people. I just participated. I think, UBC could participate as an organization, but a lot of the people participating are teachers and, people who are active in their communities in very different ways. And I think learning about the science that way, interpreting it for everyone, is so important.
Thanks, Kathy.
I am a big fan of political action by children. I mean, it's all very well to, have energy conservation at home and plant an organic garden at school, and those things are great, but politicians find it really hard to look kids in the face and continue with business as usual. So get together with their friends and show up at their mayor's office, ask for an appointment with their member of parliament or their member of the provincial legislature, and ask them to justify why it's okay that we are not on track to protect their future. And I've interviewed policymakers and politicians in many different countries for my research. And one of the messages that has come through is that there are Gretas in every country, and it's really hard for them to face them unless they do better. So demand it.
Thanks, Kathy. Tammy.
Yeah, just a quick one. So another way is to actually have short, fun workshops with children and with youths. So for instance, we had one with a particular youth camp, and all we went there to do was to teach them about food security and how Canada wastes food, and we had some kind of scenarios for them. So they were very excited to learn that. Also at COP, I saw some info about using cartoons to talk about climate change, to teach children about climate change. So I think those are fun ways to do it. They're very excited to learn through those means.
Great, thanks. Wow, we got a crowd going here. JUVARYA, how are we going to get youth excited about things like a COP meeting?
I take everything I said back and I go with what Kathy was saying, and let's lower the voting age.
Yeah, all right. Last point to RASHID.
I'm also a big fan of engaging youth, and sometimes it's just showing up when they ask you. There is an African Youth Association for Sustaining the Ocean, for example, and they send you an email. Anyone on board listening, please go talk to them. Let them know they have the power. Sometimes they don't realize. So having said that, I think we adults also have to be a bit cautious how much we expect our youth to carry on, because we are the ones at the helm of things and messing up things. Obama spent a lot of time with the youth and in his talk, and that is all well and good. But hey, Mr. President, you have the power. The people, we have to take our own responsibility seriously so the kids can help us move further, okay? And there was a young Nigerian woman in one debate, no, Ghanaian woman. She actually said, you guys are always asking the youth to do this thing. We can't even vote in most places. You don't listen to us. You have all the power, so fix the problem. I thought that there's something in there also for us. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. No, I think that's it. I mean, who's made this mess? So we're going to go to another slide. We're going to get your reaction. Oh, Kathy, did you want to say something?
I'm just saying I made the mess.
I know. We've all made the mess. That's it. So let's see if there's another slide there that we can react to. Another image that's coming out of COP, or maybe a quote from someone. Okay, Indigenous peoples have done more than any government in the world to fight against climate change. Anybody have reactions to that?
Yes, yes.
Yes, Temi, you want to say something?
That's about it. Just yes. I mean, I wouldn't debate that, right? Because obviously, for them, it's natural. It comes naturally. I mean, I'm also sort of indigenous, but not to Canada, so it comes naturally, part of the culture. Not everything in the culture and tradition is great, but when it comes to the environment, I think they're doing better than our Western model of capitalism.
Anybody else want to comment on this one? Land defenders in different places? People on the ground doing work? Yeah, Kathy.
We saw a real shift about 10, 11 years ago in climate politics with the emergence of a keep it in the ground movement, fighting fossil fuel extraction. And that's where Indigenous peoples have really been on the front line. They've been on the front line of the impacts of our extractive economies, often on their unceded land, but also in fighting against those fossil fuel developments in Canada, in South America, and elsewhere around the world.
Thanks, Rashid.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Indigenous peoples all over, you know. My own grandfather used to say we should walk on the earth as if it feels pain, you know. So this is the kind of thinking that has gone through me. I didn't realize this was sophisticated environmentalism, but I didn't know until now, right? Just because you can jump and hit the ground, don't do it. I mean, do as if it feels pain. So I agree on that very much. Again, I want to say that Indigenous people are doing their best, but they don't have the power in most places. So those who have the power have to really sit up and make sure that our environment is working well, that we deal with climate change. I always come back to this because we can ask those who are basically powerless. They want to do the great stuff, but they don't have the means and the power to do it. So, all right. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I got some handy cue cards here, right? That have been put for me, and I'm just looking at a couple of these, wondering if we've dealt with them. But the one here, this was brought up at some point. This is COP26 just a greenwashing festival? What do we think about that? Kathy says no. What's, I mean, obviously as a political scientist, maybe, but
it's all
really,
we've got. It's all we've got. Like, it may suck and it may be hugely disappointing, but we are not going to solve this problem by asking people to voluntarily change their consumer lifestyles. We need laws, and for governments to feel comfortable passing those ambitious laws, we need international collaboration.
Temi.
So, I mean, it's a very difficult situation. International law itself, which is the backbone of everything we're doing at the international level, is weak, inherently weak, right? Like I was explaining to a reporter from, I think, Global News, international law does not just become binding when you make it. So countries have their freedom to make it binding or not. At least most countries have that system in place, though they have to domesticate it. So I think while it's great to have all these agreements at the international level, I think real action is going to take place at the national level, where we have binding law, at least to meet the urgency of climate change. So I think the international arrangements are great. They can help us, you know, have some of these models to follow, things for national governments to borrow ideas from, and also make certain progress at the international level. But I don't think it's going to move us fast enough for this climate crisis. So yes, I think international agreements, international law, that's all good. It should keep on going. But I think we should actually look into national law and try to see how we can enhance implementation at the country level.
Thanks, David.
Well, what again, I'm going to offer a response that's slightly different than the question, but it's been something that I've been pondering, and some of my other panelists might have much more many more insights on this than I have, but I've been thinking about the whole business of loss and damage, and in a certain sense, that can be kind of thought of as a greenwash thing in the sense that developing countries are kind of making some gestures around climate justice issues and loss and damage and so on. But from what I've seen, there seems to be some radically different views on loss and damage issues where developing countries want developed countries to actually admit liability and provide funds for loss and damage, and developing countries are willing to provide finance but are not willing to explicitly make those kinds of acknowledgements, and there seems to be kind of differing perceptions about what's going on, and and that might actually kind of slip into a bit of a greenwash kind of thing. But more informed people like Kathy might have more insightful thoughts on this, but that's something that I've been pondering.
Thanks. Rashid, is your hand up from before, or do you have a comment on this one as well?
A quick comment about
Sure.
International engagements like what we're having, and I think sometimes we have too much expectations from this agreement, and that leads to disappointments and the mentioning of greenwashing, which is there. I'm not saying it's not there, but actually this international working together has, I think, a really important role. For example, setting targets, setting targets at that level, and then nations find their way. Sometimes they don't, but without those targets, it will be directionless. I mean, you look at the SDGs, and almost every country that's serious refers to them and sometimes tries to reach them. They don't always do, but without them, we will be so rudderless. So I find these things to be quite useful just for that.
Thanks. Iman.
So one thing is that COP26 was definitely set up to be one of the most important summits around climate change since the Paris conference. And so definitely if people feel like COP26 hasn't addressed the most important issues around climate change, then yes, it's definitely easy to just say that it was just greenwashing all along. And I think another one of the biggest criticisms as well was that it was exclusionary. Obviously, we've not just come out of COVID, and it's really made it difficult for lots of countries and communities to have representation at COP26. But I think it would have been far worse if we weren't able to have this summit for all the reasons that the other panelists have already mentioned. And maybe just slightly going back to the previous question, I think that having Indigenous communities being present at COP26, at least those that were able to make it, like the Mapuche from well, it was an Indigenous community from Latin America, and I think having them being present, being visible, really educated lots of us at COP26, and hopefully those looking in from the rest of the world. So no, I think this was a very important summit to have happened.
Thank you. David, I see your hand up, but I'm going to move on to the next card, okay? Okay, I'm going to say, how could COP27 be radically different? Iman, go ahead.
Well, I already mentioned that there was the pre-COP, so the Youth Climate Conference, but I think it would be necessary at that point to actually, for the world leaders to engage with the observers, especially the youth climate activists. That dialogue just needs to happen.
Okay, Rashid.
One of the interesting sessions I attended yesterday was actually Africa kind of discussion, because COP27 is going to be in Egypt, and some call it, they give it a name, the so-called Africa COP, right? So we were in the room, and people are beginning to think about it, and and even actually worrying that Africa will have to stand up and take responsibility and make it work. So they were complaining about some of the government not taking things serious. So my suggestion to them was that let's form a group right away. So we took the names of everybody. We are going to start an association to push and cajole and move African government to really take this serious and make sure that the world really gets a solid COP27 that helps us make progress. So that's one of the things I did yesterday that I feel good about coming here, actually. So.
Great, thank you. That's super interesting. Okay, Timmy.
So that's a very interesting question, Tara, that I've been thinking about a lot. If I should simplify it, I think the most important thing for next year would be implementation. That has come up over and over. There's this theme of trust that has been coming up across several panels, right? So the developed countries already promised 100 billion. They have not delivered on that promise, and they're making other promises. So would like to see implementation of those promises first. I think that's going to really help us move forward.
Thanks, Kathy.
One serious, one kind of fanciful. The serious one would be that all of the countries that have committed to net zero in 2050, 2060, and it's like 90% of global emissions, translate those net zero targets into 2030 targets that are consistent with that. We'd be there. And the fanciful one, if you ever watch international soccer football games and the players come in and they're each holding a little kid's hand, I wish every head of delegation at the COP meetings had a kid accompanying them, everything they did for the whole 2 weeks.
Ah, that's a great idea. That's a great idea, Kathy. Okay, I'm going to follow up on this cue card here. I don't know if you can see this one. Right? I heard somebody just say that. Timmy just said it. How would you spend 100 billion? Okay, I'll give it to you. What would you do?
Do you want me to respond?
Go ahead, Timmy, and then we'll go to JUVARYA. Timmy, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, I was just going to say, well, I think that's one of the things I also worry about. When we have the money, how are we going to spend it? I hope there's not going to be some tussle over the money, right? But I think there are already systems in place to check and make sure there's transparency. So that's one of the concerns, actually, that's even Canada, the minister from Canada brought up, and also from the people from the World Bank. So I think there will be some systems on how to ensure that the spending, really works. And I think that I would spend it towards, low carbon transition, things like renewable energy, addressing climate justice issues, addressing loss and damage, even though a lot of people don't want to talk about that. So that's my response.
Thanks. JUVARYA.
I love this question. I was in the room when Mark Carney was talking about the 130 trillion that is now going to be in service of the transition. I think we spoke earlier about, it's really a notional amount that's not there. Right after he spoke, the finance minister for Indonesia spoke, and she actually had a few pokes at him during her talk. She said, Mark, I need 150 billion right now, and Indonesia can get off coal, close down all our coal, and put in like the renewable sources we need by, I think it was 2040. So she would spend it on shutting down coal in her country, 150 billion. And when we left that room, I was looking for a bit of a change of pace after this Mark Carney thing. We went to a small cities-led conference that was happening on the side. I walked in, there was a woman who was a planner in the city of Birmingham. She was talking about her project, which was working in social housing and going in and doing deep green retrofits. And she literally said, it's not glamorous work, but it's improving people's lives. So I'd give her 100 billion and she could probably fix all the social housing maybe across the UK.
Okay, thanks. We'll go to Max. Max, I need your microphone on.
Oh, sorry. I think Jeff Bezos have pledged 2 billion to climate the climate crisis, and I think that we sometimes get lost in the difference between billion and trillion. The difference between a billion and trillion is huge. It's 1,000 billion, a trillion and trillions, and that's the scale of kind of investment that's needed. It's trillions. So the 100 billion that was pledged in the last agreement that was failed to meet in 2020. So it was only met 25 billion so far of the 100 billion. It needs to be ramped up to trillions. How would I spend the 100 billion into research, further research into renewables? And as JUVARYA was talking about, some things are not the very pretty things, the kind of the retrofits, the sort of local politics as well. There's a lot of more research needs to be put into that as well.
Okay. I'm going to switch off. Rashid, I see your hand, but I'm going to move to the last section to make sure that you all have a chance to go through your headlines before we wrap up today. So if you're ready, I can go to you, Rashid. Do you have a headline that you would share with us that you would like to see coming out of this COP? Oh, we need your microphone on. Yeah, great.
Healthy oceans are climate action.
Healthy oceans are climate action.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. I can go through my screen. Maybe I'll go down to David, sorry.
Well, I'd love it if they were able to say current commitments keep 1.5 alive.
Current commitments keep 1.5 alive. Okay, JUVARYA.
World agrees to phase out fossil fuels within next 5 years, and all the 200 countries signed the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Great. Max.
Governments commit to ensuring the just transition for all.
I missed your last word. Your just transition.
Oh, for everyone. For everyone.
Oh, for everyone. Okay, sorry. I caught the last part there. Great. Just transition for everyone. Okay, Kathy.
China-US agreement plus $500 billion gives hope for COP27.
Okay, Temi.
I'd be hopeful and look forward and say climate justice served at COP26.
Great. EMAN.
I completely agree with Dr. Harrison, although I was willing to be happy with just $100 billion fund being a reality by the end of this year.
Great. Did I catch everyone? Yeah. So I hope we can leave COP this time with headlines that come out like that. I'm wondering in this last second, do you have a headline that's more what you expect to see?
Is this to everybody?
Sure, you can give it to, yeah.
Yeah. Tax fossil fuel and give people basic income. That would actually solve lots of problems, I think. Tax them, reduce the pollution, and give people basic income so they improve livelihoods of people, and then we can get to a better place.
Kathy.
Hope fading for 1.5C. Sorry.
Yeah, that's something we're going to have to deal with. I think that's an interesting, can we hold on to that? JUVARYA.
Cities get back to work fighting climate, but still only get 7 cents on the dollar.
Temi?
Well, just the opposite. Climate injustice at COP26.
David, you write headlines, or maybe you don't. Maybe your editor puts the headline on it. What's going to be the headline of your last report from COP?
Well, not literally, but I think I think the headlines will be something like progress made, but not enough.
Okay, yeah. So I hope you're all out there. Those of you who are still there, you know, pushing. We all are watching, really. As you know, the world is watching on this one. There's so much at stake. But I'd like to thank you all for joining us today, live from COP, and I'm looking forward to meeting with the delegates, the UBC delegates, and David, our UBC reporter, when we come back, and get together with you again and to hear about your experiences. And thank you. I'd like to thank the audience who was joining us today, who was engaging with us in the questions, and obviously the passion and interest that's involved in this meeting this year round. I mean, from somebody at home, I can say it's on the news every day. We're hearing it all the time. So this COP definitely has a profile that I don't think I've seen in previous years. Every single day that you've been there, we've been hearing something about it. So again, thank you all for joining us. Our panelists, I'd also like to thank the team that has put together, who built some cue cards for me as I could go do this. So we had John, Natalie, Tim, Pablo, and Nadia working in the back rooms here to make sure that this could be pulled off. I would really like to thank them. Of course, I thank the audience for joining us today. And for those of you who are interested in what's the next steps and what comes next, I would ask you to consider participating in our the UBC Read Sustainability. Upcoming, we have author and poet Dallas Hunt. So this is a production that the UBC Sustainability Initiative will be putting on November 18th from 4 to 5:30. So Dallas will be reading from his book called Cree Land, and it'll be followed by a moderated discussion with UBC Climate Hub's Esme Decker and an audience question and answer. So there's more resources on the UBC Sustainability Initiative page, UBC. There we go. We've got, so I don't have to say it out loud for you. And we'll just keep our eyes on this the whole time, put as much pressure as you can on the negotiators who were there in these last couple days. So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. Yeah. Bye.